March 12, 1944, Camp Upton, New York. Dawn thinly sliced the horizon into pale orange and gray as a rattle of boxcars eased onto the spur track and stopped. The metal wheels exhaled steam. Inside one car, Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Müller pressed his forehead to the slatted wood and counted the slivers of light as if they were the last hours of something he still refused to name. He smelled hay, oil, and the sweet, sour sting of stale sweat that had soaked into the uniforms of men who'd been packed in like split potatoes for days. Outside, a sergeant in a U.S. Army wool field jacket, Sergeant James O'Rourke, a man with a smoker's voice and a map tucked into his breast pocket, opened the car door with a shout. The prisoners filed out into cold air that smelled of wood smoke and fresh-cut grass. Karl-Heinz blinked and felt the world tilt. There were green trees, blue sky, and, impossibly, American soldiers handing out steaming cups of coffee from a galvanized urn. The metal tasted of heat and something darker. The coffee itself was thin, black, and alive. A corporal barked orders and a list was read. Names, ranks, numbers, each pronounced in clipped English that the German men could only sometimes parse. They were ordered toward a long-tented compound, ringed by coils of barbed wire and watchtowers, where men in khaki with M1 carbines methodically scanned the perimeter. The men shuffled forward, boots clinking on wooden planks, faces hollow under caps too small or too large. The first thing Karl-Heinz saw, the thing that lodged in his chest like a hot coal, was the mess tent. It was a long canvas cathedral with rows of steel tables and pans steaming on a line. He watched an American cook, a broad-shouldered private with grease under his fingernails and a navy haircut, ladle out bowls of thick potato soup and hand a chunk of pale bread to a man whose teeth had not touched such a loaf in months. The bread had a crust that sang when it broke, and a crumb so soft it almost absorbed the steam. Around them, men from Bavaria, Saxony, and Prussia stared as if the mess tent were a miracle bestowed by some capricious saint. Bread, someone whispered. The words slid across the tables like a newly learned prayer. Karl-Heinz clutched the tin cup of coffee with both hands. He had last drunk coffee brewed with ersatz chicory months ago, ration cards clipped and clipped again, a sachet of powder that barely pretended to be warmth. His mother in Dresden had written of long lines, of a child's thin cheeks, of the baker's shop shuttered and looted after the raids. He felt the image of her hands, pale from cold, reach into the silence of memory and come away with nothing. Here, across an ocean he had not seen in years, bowls were full and milk, real milk not powdered, was poured from metal jugs while American cooks joked and whistled tunelessly. The officers were processed separately under a canvas awning where a lieutenant with stern eyebrows, Lieutenant Robert Winslow, asked questions with a tally pad and a pencil that left indelible black marks. He wore a wristwatch and a clean collar, and when Karl-Heinz stammered his name, the lieutenant pronounced it with more respect than the rank deserved. Outside the processing lines, Red Cross vans hummed. Women in blue dresses with red crosses on their sleeves unloaded wooden boxes stamped relief and food parcels. Karl-Heinz watched a parcel open and the contents spill. Tins of Spam, sardines, chocolate, packets of dried fruit. A murmur traveled like wind. He had seen German care packages, sometimes good, sometimes empty, but never so many parcels clustered like a small private orchard of supplies. At the far end of the compound, a notice board displayed a menu, 3 words per line, printed in block letters. Breakfast, milk, bread, oatmeal. Lunch, potato, beef, vegetables. Supper, stew, bread, coffee. The men read it as if deciphering Holy Scripture. A corporal with a clipboard announced the camp rules in German as he'd been trained to. precise hygiene, roll call, work details. The men nodded mechanically, but inside each one, a sharper understanding was taking shape. This place ran not on fear alone, but on schedules and provisions. It had kitchens, but it also had soap and fresh water, and latrines that were kept clean. There were blankets issued that smelled faintly of disinfectant rather than damp mildew. Across the Atlantic, Karl-Heinz knew, Dresden smoldered in memory, and ration cards were clipped down to wafers. He had letters, brittle with creases, describing blackout curtains, air raid sirens that woke children and stole the hours, and neighbors with hollow faces pooling whatever grain they could. He could picture Frau Müller, his mother, buying a tiny ration of margarine and measuring it into a cup as if it were a treasure. The contrast slammed into him with the force of a closing train door. On one side, ruins and ration lines. On the other, a canvas tent where men laughed and were offered cups of warm milk without counting the cost. As they were led to the bunks, the sound of laughter drifted over from a recreational hut, where an American soldier tuned a battered radio, and a blues saxophone crept into the cold. Karl-Heinz listened, heart a bitter stone, tasting gratitude and shame in equal measure. Men exchanged glances that asked the same unspoken question. How could the world be so unjust that a captured soldier could be fed better than the people he'd left behind? They had come here as enemies. Now they were measured by the comfort of a loaf and the warmth of milk.
The next morning began with a bell. Not an alarm siren. Not an air raid klaxon. But a hand-rung bell that chimed through the still New York air. The camp stirred awake to the rhythmic thud of boots on frozen ground, the faint clink of tin cups, and the distant hum of an American flag being raised up its pole. Karl-Heinz stood among hundreds of fellow POWs in neat lines as the guards, rifles slung casually, counted heads. It was cold, but not cruelly so. Frost glimmered along the barbed wire like dew caught in steel cobwebs. The mess tent was already alive, steam rising from a field kitchen where American cooks worked with a kind of easy energy that no one in Germany could have afforded by this stage of the war. Inside the tent, breakfast trays were already stacked. A corporal ladled oatmeal thick as cement. A spoonful of sugar shimmering on top. Each man received a slice of soft white bread and, to Karl-Heinz's disbelief, a glass of milk, real milk. Chilled. Creamy. Full. Around him, men hesitated. Afraid it might be a trick. Afraid the taste would betray them to homesickness. When he took a sip, it struck his tongue with a flavor so rich he almost flinched. He could not help thinking of his younger sister, Greta. Her last letter, smudged and written in a shaky hand, had described bread made of barley and sawdust, and soup stretched so thin it reflected candlelight. We eat as if pretending. She had written, "Your nieces have forgotten what an apple smells like." Now Karl-Heinz sat at a table beneath a canvas roof, eating better than anyone he loved. He looked up at the American cook serving seconds, a man with freckles and a grin, and wondered if he even knew that the enemy sitting before him had once flown across Europe dropping bombs or firing rifles in fury. The days took on a rhythm. Morning roll call. Then work details, repairing fences, unloading supplies, or tending gardens that would later feed them all. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. German soldiers, who had marched through conquered fields from Poland to France, now turned American soil to grow beans and lettuce for their own dinner. At noon, they'd line up for lunch, stew with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots floating in a broth fragrant with garlic and onions. Sometimes there was fruit, tinned peaches, bright syrup glistening under the sunlight that streamed through the mess tent's flaps. Men dipped bread into the syrup, grinning like boys. Rumors spread, as rumors always did. Someone had seen the camp's ration logs. The U.S. Army was bound by the Geneva Convention to feed prisoners at the same standard as their own soldiers. That meant 3,000 calories a day, far more than any German civilian could hope for. Some whispered that captured Americans in German camps starved on watery soup while their own bellies here grew rounder by the week. Letters confirmed it. Whenever mail arrived, the air turned heavy. Men opened envelopes with trembling hands, reading words that seemed to come from another planet. Families wrote of bombings, of burned bakeries, of coal shortages and weeks without meat. They wrote that people now fought over scraps, that potatoes were hoarded, that winter had stolen more lives than the front itself. One evening, after mail call, Karl-Heinz sat on his bunk staring at his mother's latest letter. Her handwriting was smaller now, each word compressed to save space, and perhaps paper. "We are proud you are alive," she wrote. "Do not worry about us. The Führer says we are close to victory. But the bakery is gone." And Frau Lenz from across the street traded her wedding ring for butter. He folded the paper slowly, aware of the full bowl of soup still warm in his lap. The wooden spoon felt heavy. Around him, other men sat silent, some with heads bowed, some staring blankly into the smoke curling from the small iron stove that kept their barrack warm. That night, as the guards made rounds, the camp seemed oddly peaceful. Beyond the wire, the wind carried the smell of pine and diesel. Inside, men slept with full stomachs and uneasy hearts. For the first time in months, no one feared dying. Yet none could escape the gnawing guilt that survival here, in this foreign place of abundance, had come at the cost of seeing their homeland unravel. Even O'Rourke, the American sergeant, sensed it. He stood at the gatehouse sipping his own coffee and watched the floodlights wash across the compound. "Funny," he muttered to his partner. "They get better grub than half the boys in Brooklyn." His partner chuckled. But O'Rourke didn't smile. He knew these men were enemy soldiers, but looking at their gaunt faces softening with food and rest, they didn't seem like monsters. Just men who'd lost a different kind of war. Inside the barracks, Karl-Heinz couldn't sleep. He listened to someone humming a lullaby, perhaps from the Rhineland, and stared through the window slit at the moon beyond the wire. It gleamed like milk in the dark. For the first time, he wondered what Germany would even look like if he ever went home again. By late spring of 1944, Camp Upton had settled into a strange rhythm, half prison, half farm, half school. The prisoners rose with the bell, worked the fields, built fences, or helped the local community harvest crops short on labor. The guards stood watch, but not with the harshness of SS overseers or Soviet sentries. Here, the rifles stayed mostly slung, their muzzles pointing toward the ground. Karl-Heinz had joined one of the work detachments that loaded lumber at a nearby sawmill. They were paid in canteen coupons, tokens that could be traded for cigarettes, chocolate, or postcards. He'd never thought he'd crave a Hershey bar. But the taste was something almost mythical, sweet, creamy, distinctly foreign. It melted on the tongue like a truce. Each day, trucks rumbled past the gate, taking groups of POWs out to work under civilian contractors. Some Americans waved. Children sometimes watched from fences, curious rather than hostile. For men who had marched through Poland or France, it was disorienting to be treated as laborers, not captives, to be addressed with names, not numbers. At noon, they'd stop for a meal. The Americans brought out metal containers, chili, cornbread, sliced apples. The food steamed in the cool air. Karl-Heinz remembered how, in France, he had seen captured French soldiers eat from filthy tins while guards laughed. Here, no one laughed at them. The Americans ate beside them, talking baseball, the weather, home. It was during one of these breaks that another letter arrived. This one from Greta, his sister. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. "They say Berlin has changed," she wrote. "We no longer hear music in the cafes. The bakery lines stretch for hours. But the worst is not hunger. It is silence. No one speaks about what comes next. Karl-Heinz folded the letter and stared at his untouched slice of cornbread. The smell of it, butter and sugar, filled his nose until it turned sour. Around him, other prisoners quietly read their own letters, eyes flicking between the food and the paper. That evening, when the Red Cross truck came through, the men gathered around the notice board. Someone had posted new clippings, photographs from Life magazine showing American factories, endless lines of jeeps, aircraft wings stacked like plates, women welding steel in bandanas and rolled sleeves. It was a revelation. The scale was incomprehensible. Karl-Heinz remembered his days in the Luftwaffe, the shortages, the desperate attempts to patch engines with scavenged parts, the pilots sent up in worn-out planes. Looking at the photos, he realized what the officers back home had always denied: Germany could never match this. The war was already lost. And every ration card his mother clutched in Dresden was proof. The next morning, during roll call, an argument broke out in the line. Two prisoners, one still fiercely loyal to Hitler, accused another of being unpatriotic for saying aloud that America was too big to defeat. The shouting echoed across the yard until the guards intervened. Karl-Heinz watched in silence. He didn't join the argument. He didn't have to. Inside, the truth had already hardened into something colder than disbelief. Days passed. Work continued. The Americans brought in radio broadcasts for the canteen, censored, but still alive with news and jazz. One night, they heard that Rome had fallen. The prisoners stared at the radio, listening to a language they only half understood. But they recognized the names: Anzio, Salerno, Cassino. Defeat by defeat. The Reich shrank in their minds. Later, that same evening, O'Rourke stopped by the barracks with an extra crate of bread. "We've got surplus today," he said. "Can't waste it." The men stared. No one in Germany would ever use the word surplus about bread again. Karl-Heinz took a loaf, warm and heavy in his hands, and carried it to his bunk. He tore it in half, then half again, staring at the steam rising from its core. He closed his eyes and imagined sending it home, imagined his mother's face, his sister's thin hands breaking it carefully, rationing each crumb. The thought made his throat ache. He whispered quietly to the man in the next bunk, "My mother would cry if she saw this." The man nodded. So would mine. That night, some of the POWs took the scraps from dinner, bits of bread, leftover stew, and quietly left them outside the barracks for the camp dogs that wandered near the wire. It was their small, wordless way of easing the guilt that hung over every full plate. When the guards made their midnight rounds, they found the men sleeping soundly, the air rich with the smell of bread and wine. Beyond the wire, a train passed, its whistle echoing across the fields. For a brief moment, the sound reminded Karl-Heinz of home, not the burning cities, not the slogans, but the small, human sound of life continuing somewhere beyond the madness of war. He turned on his side, eyes open in the dark, and thought, if this is captivity, then what has freedom become? Autumn came early to Camp Upton. The air grew sharp and smelled faintly of burning leaves. Rows of maples along the perimeter fence began to turn, their red and gold leaves drifting down like slow-moving embers. The war, though distant, pressed closer every day through the radios that crackled in the recreation hall. Normandy, Paris, the Allies were advancing, and everyone in the camp knew what that meant. One crisp morning, Karl-Heinz woke to the sound of a guard shouting over the hum of the generator. News had come. France was liberated. The war, it seemed, was rolling inexorably toward Germany's heart. Men gathered around the loudspeaker in the mess tent, cups of coffee steaming in their hands. As the announcer's voice spoke of American forces crossing the Seine, of cities falling one by one, no one cheered. Not even the Americans. For the prisoners, the words landed like stones in water, deep, silent ripples of fear and relief all at once. For the guards, there was the grim awareness that this war would still demand more lives before it ended. Later that week, The Red Cross distributed new parcels, soap, cigarettes, cocoa, and small chocolate bars wrapped in foil. Each German received one. Even those who had shouted pro-Nazi slogans months before. That night, as he unwrapped the chocolate, Karl-Heinz felt its soft crack beneath his fingers and wondered if his mother had ever even seen such a thing in recent years. He didn't eat it right away. He placed it on the small shelf beside his bunk, saving it as if it were something sacred, a reminder that abundance could exist without cruelty. Days grew shorter. The camp was quieter now, fewer new prisoners arrived. And some were transferred west. One morning, O'Rourke gathered the men near the gate. "End of the season," he said, pointing to the fields beyond. "You boys did good work. Crops came in strong." It was true, they had harvested enough to feed not only themselves but the nearby town. Local farmers, once suspicious, now waved to them as the trucks rolled past. Some even traded small favors, fresh fruit for handmade toys or carved trinkets. For men who had once been part of a war machine, the act of simple labor felt almost redemptive. That evening, the mess hall served something special: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and gravy. The smell filled every corner of the tent. Men sat at long tables, the warm light flickering across their faces. Karl-Heinz raised his fork and paused, looking around, seeing, for the first time, not enemies and guards, but men. Just men. A radio played faint swing music from the corner, the crackle of the broadcast filling the spaces between conversations. The camp commandant entered, Colonel Harper. A tall, deliberate man who spoke German slowly but respectfully. He tapped his glass with a spoon. "You are prisoners," he said. "But you are also human beings. The war will end soon. When it does, remember this: how you were treated here, what you have seen. Take that memory home with you." The room fell into quiet. Men who had survived Stalingrad, the U-boat pens, and the desert campaigns sat motionless, the weight of those words pressing down harder than any iron gate. When Karl-Heinz finally ate, he realized he wasn't hungry. Not really. The food was delicious, tender, seasoned, perfectly cooked, but each bite carried a strange sadness. He thought of Greta, of the empty kitchen table back in Dresden, of his mother scraping the bottom of a flour tin, of sirens echoing through shattered streets. A few weeks later, letters arrived again. This time, the handwriting was faint, almost fragile. His mother's words trembled on the page. "The bombing has stopped. There is little left of the city. We survive on what we can find. I hear rumors that you are safe and fed. If that is true, I am glad. Perhaps it is better that one of us eats well." He read it again and again until the ink smudged under his fingertips. That night, he broke his last piece of chocolate in half and pressed it between the pages of her letter, sealing the sweetness there as if to share it somehow across the ocean. By the spring of 1946, repatriation began. Men packed their few belongings, letters, carvings, photographs. As Karl-Heinz stepped into the truck that would take him to the port, O'Rourke shook his hand. "Take care, Muller," the sergeant said. "You were a decent worker. Maybe the world'll make sense again someday." Karl-Heinz smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said, "if we remember how to feed people instead of fight them." The truck rumbled away down the dirt road. Behind the wire, the camp faded, the watchtowers, the mess hall, the smell of coffee in the morning. Ahead lay a country in ruins, a home he no longer quite recognized. But he carried with him the image of a simple meal: bread, milk, and coffee served by the hands of those he'd once called enemies. In the end, that was what stayed with him. Not the humiliation of capture, nor the loss of a cause, but the strange, unforgettable kindness that had made captivity taste, impossibly, like dignity.